Monica, it's interesting you asked that question because I think it's the most asked question of me anyway, by the media and public audiences whenever I speak to the media or have an opportunity to speak to people about universal childcare systems. You know, they say, oh, you make all these great arguments, so how come we don't have it? And like Martha, I see many names of participants. I recognize many I don't, and I'm sure everybody has their own opinion. So I'm really looking forward to people answering this question also in the chat, because that will help me answer questions that the media and that I get so often. I want to offer a couple of reasons. One is it's only government that can actually deliver a universal childcare system. That's why we have governments, to do for everybody collectively what can't be done well individually and personally. And the reason we don't have one is that governments in Canada to date, and I say governments plural, of all political stripes and different levels, have essentially continue to make the care of children, the early education of children, an individual personal responsibility, not a collective public responsibility. And by individual, I mean a woman's responsibility primarily, whether it be mothers or grandmothers, aunties, other women in different family units, whatever shape and form family units take, and also the responsibility of very low paid female workers, care workers. And this has been the case historically and continue to be the case even in Canada as more and more women entered the paid labor force. That women continue to be given, whether you're in the paid labor force or not, it's really up to women to care for children and provide for their early childhood education. And if you're in the paid labor force, that expectation of women is to do both often. And that's one of the things that we've seen through the pandemic crisis very visibly, that women in the paid labor force are expected to do both, but during the pandemic at the same time. Even where we've had childcare offered outside the home for a fee, it's been regarded as an individual responsibility rather than a collective public responsibility, in what, as Martha talked about, reinforced by the market-based approach to the provision of childcare. So very few childcare programs in Canada, with the exception of some municipalities, mostly in Ontario, actually set up childcare. It's always interesting to me when governments talk about creating childcare spaces, because governments actually don't create childcare spaces. The job of creating childcare spaces, of putting in place childcare services, rests on individuals, again, either on a for-profit or not-for-profits, you know, through individual entrepreneurship, but more so individuals who have come together in non-governmental organizations or community groups to actually put in place the childcare. And so childcare is not regarded as a public service. It's not one, as Martha was saying, a public service that is planned and managed for the good of children and the greater good of society. It's not seen as a public good that can be used to advance broader public policy objectives like improving equity, improving the standard of living, the health, public policies like full employment or near full employment, or even economic growth. And, you know, why haven't governments decided this should be offered as a public service. Why do they keep relying on the individual? I'd say two main reasons. One is because to do otherwise would require a lot of attention and significant resources. And another is because they've gotten away with it. Because actually, for the most part, we have scrambled and taken care of the early learning and childcare not well, but they have gotten away by putting the burden on us. And that brings us to a third point. I think the main reason we haven't made as much progress as we might and need is because there hasn't been enough organized pressure on government. And as Martha said, I'd suggest it really is only in the last decade, maybe 15, 20 years, where childcare and early learning has been understood and been presented as critical to the well-being and the development of children from birth, that it's something that is good for all children. It's not a welfare program, it's actually a service that benefits all across the economic spectrum, across communities. That it is good for gender equity, good for building community, and good for parents in the labor force and also parents who are not in the paid labor force. So I think it's in starting to understand and present childcare as a public good that has broad public objectives and can bring a lot of change in a lot of different areas. It's because of that we're starting to see some progress, because there's a broad consensus of what needs to be done within the childcare community and outside, and that actually this is the way forward to continue to build coalition, to continue to build consensus, and most importantly, to transfer that consensus and that coalition into strong political advocacy for change.
Thank you, Morna. And Chris.
Oh, thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. And like Martha, it's great to see some familiar names and some new names. So I'd just like to initially acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the Treaty 6 region of Canada, which is traditional meeting place and traveling routes for Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux peoples. So as part of the panel, I was really struggling because we've each got 2 or 3 minutes to speak to a monumental question. And the question we're really wrestling with is will the pandemic be a trigger or an agent of change in terms of thinking about early learning and childcare and public policy in respect to that? And I went back to some of the political science readings that I look at occasionally. And what I was looking at is what does it take within a complex area of social policy for policy change to take place that is of significance? And what it takes, I think we would all know this, it takes an alignment of the political rationale, the willingness, the political leadership to take that change, that alignment with what we might think of as cultural rationale or cultural logics. And in early learning and childcare, those cultural logics speak to key areas like an understanding of childhood, a understanding of family roles and responsibilities, an understanding of maternal employment and women's participation in the labor force. But they also speak quite critically in terms of cultural values, and this is a fuzzy set with the ideology, to the notion of what is our understanding of the role of government in modern contemporary societies, and what is our understanding of the nature of social policy and the nature of public goods versus private services. And in that context, I think it's fair to say for the pandemic to trigger a change, it's going to require, in some ways, a swimming against the dominant social, economic, political tides. And those dominant tides have now been with us for 30 years. And those dominant tides speak to, in some ways, a lessening of the role of governments in civil society, and in some ways, a diminishing of the capacity of governments to play that role. And that really, I think, it didn't start in the 1990s, but it came to the fore in the 1990s in terms of federal leadership in aspects of social economic policy. And there was a lowering of the sights, if you like, a lowering of expectations. And in some ways, we've had 3 decades of commentators telling us that the government can't do this and government can't do that. And so I think we need to be clear that that's a dominant trend, the lowering of social sights around understanding the role of government. The second one is we're seeing a changing relationship between federal and provincial governments. And in terms of building a national system, I think what we're looking at is a strong, legitimate relationship between federal and provincial territorial governments and federal and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governments. And what that's going to require is politically a move away from the open federalism that we've, I shouldn't say enjoyed for the last 3 decades, but we've seen for the last 3 decades, to more of a legitimate understanding of a role of federal leadership and investment in areas that are in a national interest. And we need to think through what that means. And then in the third area, I think there's a real sense that over the last 3 decades, we've seen a fiscalization of social policy. So when we think about how to address social and economic issues, what we've seen is a resort to tax measures, a resort to individual transfers to families to support economic and social well-being. And so if we're talking about building a pan-Canadian system or systems of early learning and childcare, we need to raise our sights and we need to move away from the fiscalization of social policy. We don't build systems through transferring money to individuals. We don't build systems through block transferring money from the federal government to provincial territorial governments. We need leadership and direction. So in some ways, I'm going to sum up, if I go back to the poet Robert Frost, we need to take the road that is less traveled. To build a pan-Canadian system, we need to take the road that is less traveled. And the question for all of us is has the pandemic resulted in a new alignment of cultural values and political rationale? And I guess the answer is we will find out. I think it's to be determined.